I think when you get older, baseball stops looking the way it did when you were young. When I was a kid in Oklahoma, the game felt simple. You watched the stars. You copied their stance in the backyard. You memorized batting averages from the newspaper. Back then, greatness looked larger than life, almost untouchable. But after you spend 20 years in Major League Baseball, after your knees hurt every morning, after you catch thousands of innings behind the plate, you start seeing things differently. You stop judging players by headlines. You remember smaller things instead. The sound their spikes made walking into the clubhouse, the silence they created in a stadium, the way grown men reacted to them. That's what stayed with me. People ask me all the time who the greatest baseball players were. Not the most famous, not the loudest, the greatest. The men who made other ball players stop talking during batting practice just to watch them work. I was lucky I played in an era filled with those kinds of men. Some of them were teammates, some were opponents, some barely even looked human once the game started. And as a catcher, maybe I noticed things other people missed. Catchers see fear. We see hesitation. We see how dugouts change when certain names walk to the plate. I played against Hall of Famers almost every week for a while there, but only a handful truly stayed with me all these years later. Not because of statistics, because when you were standing on that field with them, you could feel baseball changing around you. And the first man on my list is probably the purest hitter I ever saw in my life. Hank Aaron never looked like he was trying to impress anybody. That's one of the first things I remember about him. Some players walked into a stadium wanting attention. Bigger smile, louder voice, flashier clothes. Hank was the opposite. Quiet, calm, almost relaxed. If you didn't know baseball, you might not even realize you were standing next to one of the greatest players who ever lived. But the minute the game started, everything changed. I remember watching him during batting practice the first time and thinking something felt different. Not violent power, not uppercut swings trying to launch balls into orbit. Everything was controlled, short, efficient, like he already knew exactly where the baseball was going before the pitcher released it. That's what amazed players about Hank. He never looked rushed. A lot of sluggers scared pitchers because they swung hard. Hank scared pitchers because he almost never wasted movement. You could throw inside, outside, high, low, breaking ball, fastball. It didn't seem to matter for very long. Eventually he adjusted, and once Hank Aaron adjusted to you, the night usually got bad. What people forget now is how much pressure followed that man everywhere. Every stadium, every road trip, every season. By the time I came into the league, he wasn't just chasing home runs anymore. He was carrying baseball history on his back every single day. And he carried it with more dignity than most people ever could. Players noticed that. You have to understand, clubhouses back then were rough places. Ball players respected toughness more than anything. If a man complained too much, nobody listened to him. If a man folded under pressure, everybody remembered it. Hank never folded, not publicly, not privately. Even when the attention around the home run record became overwhelming, he still walked to the plate looking calm enough to order dinner. I honestly don't know how he did it. As a catcher, I used to study hitters constantly. Timing, hands, balance, emotional reactions. You learn to recognize panic. Hank almost never showed any. That's rare for power hitters. Most sluggers go cold eventually and start chasing pitches, and Hank trusted himself. That's why he lasted so long. His swing aged better than almost anybody's because it was built on balance instead of violence. And then there was the consistency. That's the word every player uses when they talk about Hank Aaron. Consistency. Not for one summer. Not for 3 years. Decade after decade. 20 home runs, 30 home runs, 40 home runs. Every season felt the same. Like the man had signed a private agreement with baseball itself. A lot of players had higher peaks. Very few were greater. I think that's why older ball players respected him so deeply. We understood how hard that kind of consistency really was. Long flights, bad knees, slumps, media pressure, family pressure, younger players taking your job. Hank survived all of it quietly. And the craziest part is this: he never carried himself like a superstar around other players. No arrogance, no performance, no need to dominate a room. That kind of confidence is usually the real thing. You know, when you catch thousands of games, certain swings stay in your memory forever. Hank Aaron's swing is one of them: compact, fast, ruthless. Like baseball had been simplified into one perfect motion. And honestly, I'm not sure anybody ever did it better. Pete Rose was completely different from Hank Aaron. Hank made baseball look calm. Pete made baseball feel dangerous. I spent years beside Pete in Cincinnati, and I can tell you right now, there was no such thing as a relaxed game when he was around. Spring training game, Sunday afternoon game in July, exhibition game, didn't matter. Pete played every inning like somebody had insulted his family before first pitch. That energy spread through the whole clubhouse. Some players turn intensity on and off. Pete couldn't. I honestly don't think he knew how. He walked fast, talked fast, took batting practice hard, ran to first base hard, argued hard, laughed hard. Everything about him felt turned up higher than normal people. And when you're around a guy like that every day, you either get tired of him or you get better because of him. Most of us got better. People today throw around the phrase love of the game pretty casually. Pete actually lived it. I've never seen another player who seemed so emotionally connected to every single at bat. Every ground ball mattered to him. Every inning mattered. If Pete went 0 for 4, you could feel the frustration sitting beside him after the game. That's what made him exhausting sometimes. But it's also what made him special. I remember watching him dive headfirst into bases during games that probably didn't deserve that kind of sacrifice. Most veterans protect themselves over time. Baseball seasons are long. Your body starts making business decisions for you once you get older. Pete ignored all of that. Honestly, I think part of him enjoyed proving people wrong physically. He wasn't the fastest man in baseball, wasn't the strongest, wasn't built like Willie Mays or Hank Aaron. So he compensated by making every game feel personal. And pitchers hated that because Pete wore people down mentally, fouled pitches off, took awkward at bats, forced infielders to rush throws. He created tension. You never felt comfortable with him at the plate because he refused to give away anything easily. As a catcher, I appreciated players like that more than fans probably realize. People think catchers only admire talent. We admire survival, durability, mental pressure, consistency. Over 6 months, Pete did that better than almost anybody I ever saw. And the thing that separated him from a lot of stars was this: he genuinely loved competing against great players. Some hitters secretly hope the ace pitcher gets scratched before game time. Pete wanted the best guy on the mound. He wanted the challenge. That attitude changed the Big Red Machine. People remember the talent on those Reds teams, and yeah, we had talent everywhere. But Pete's personality became part of the engine. He dragged intensity into the clubhouse every day, whether you wanted it or not. Sometimes it drove people crazy. Sometimes it won games before first pitch. I've laughed over the years hearing people describe Pete as only a hustler. That's too simple. Hustle alone doesn't get you over 4,000 hits. Plenty of players run hard for a few seasons. Pete combined obsession with preparation. He studied pitchers constantly, understood situations, understood momentum. He was smarter than people gave him credit for. And I'll tell you something else most fans never saw. Pete expected greatness from the players around him because he expected it from himself first. That's why teammates respected him even when he irritated them. Nobody could accuse Pete Rose of asking others to work harder than he did. That would have been impossible. You know, baseball has always had prettier swings than Pete Rose's swing. More graceful players, too. But if we're talking about competitors, pure competitors, men who treated baseball like oxygen itself, Pete belongs near the top of any list I could ever make. Because nobody I ever met loved to fight more than Pete Rose. Joe Morgan was probably the smartest baseball player I ever shared a field with. And when I say smart, I don't mean the kind of smart people talk about on television now. I mean baseball smart. The kind that changes games quietly before anybody in the crowd even realizes what happened. Joe could feel momentum shifting before the rest of us did. That's rare. When people remember the Big Red Machine, they usually start with the power. Bench, Perez, Rose, Foster, the home runs, the crowds, the championships. But inside that clubhouse, a lot of us knew Joe was the engine making everything work. He controlled the rhythm of games. I noticed that early because catchers pay attention to details other players miss. Joe wasn't physically intimidating. He wasn't 6'5". He didn't walk around looking like a heavyweight fighter. But by the fifth inning, somehow, he always seemed to be involved in the biggest moment of the game. Walk, stolen base, line drive, defensive play, something. And once Joe started affecting the game, pitchers got uncomfortable fast. I remember sitting in clubhouses, listening to opposing teams talk about him. They sounded frustrated more than angry because Joe forced you to think constantly. You couldn't relax for one pitch. If he got on base, the whole game changed immediately. That little batting stance of his used to drive pitchers crazy too. Fans remember the elbow movement, the rhythm, the way he looked almost smaller in the batter's box, but then the ball came off the bat hard every single year, consistently hard. That's another thing people overlook about Joe Morgan. He wasn't just a second baseman with speed. The man had real power, real discipline, real understanding of the strike zone. And because he understood pitchers so well, he almost always seemed one step ahead mentally. I loved watching that. As a catcher, you appreciate players who understand the hidden chess match happening during games. Joe understood it as well as anybody I ever saw. Sometimes I honestly think he knew what pitchers wanted to throw before they knew themselves. And defensively, he made life easier for everybody around him. Double play turns, positioning, communication, leadership. He brought calm into pressure situations. That matters more than fans realize over a long season. Clubhouses can get tense. Losing streaks wear people down. Joe had a way of keeping the game under control emotionally. Not loud leadership either. Quiet confidence. That usually lasts longer. One thing I respected about Joe was how hard he worked despite already being great. Hall of Fame players usually have enough talent to get lazy eventually. Joe never really did. He studied pitchers constantly, paid attention constantly, asked questions constantly. That kind of curiosity keeps players elite longer than athleticism does. And I think because Joe looked different from traditional superstars, some people underestimated him at first. Baseball has always loved obvious greatness. Big bodies, big home runs, big personalities. Joe beat people another way. He beat them mentally. You'd look up in the seventh inning and suddenly he'd already walked twice, stolen a base, scored 2 runs, turned a double play, and somehow controlled the entire game without anybody noticing when it started happening. That's a special player. Honestly, there were days with the Reds where it felt like Joe Morgan already knew how the game was going to end before first pitch. That kind of instinct can't really be taught. Some men just see baseball differently. Joe was one of those men, and from where I sat behind the plate all those years, I can tell you something simple. Our team never felt smarter than when Joe Morgan was on the field. Sandy Koh-fax felt bigger than baseball when I was young. That's honestly the best way I can describe it. Before I ever became an all-star catcher, before the championships, before the Hall of Fame conversations, I was just another kid watching television trying to understand how one pitcher could make major league hitters look completely helpless. And Sandy did that to people regularly. You have to remember what baseball looked like back then. The game moved differently. Pitchers worked fast. Hitters were tougher emotionally. Ball players didn't talk openly about fear very often. But when Sandy Koh-fax was pitching, you could feel something unusual even through the television screen. The tension felt heavier. I eventually got to see him up close, and somehow he looked calmer in person than he did on television. That almost made it scarier. Some dominant athletes carry visible intensity. You can see them trying to overpower everybody around them. Sandy barely seemed to change expressions. Then he'd throw a fastball that exploded past somebody, or a curveball that looked unfair. That curveball probably ruined more confident swings than any pitch I ever saw from that era. Hitters knew it was coming and still couldn't stay back on it consistently. The break looked too late, too sharp, like gravity suddenly changed halfway to home plate. As a catcher, I became obsessed with studying pitchers, arm angles, tempo, emotional control. Sandy fascinated me because nothing about him looked rushed. Great pitchers usually have mechanics that repeat under pressure, and Sandy repeated everything beautifully. Same motion, same balance, same calmness. Pressure didn't seem to speed him up, and that's one reason hitters struggled so badly against him. Panic spreads quickly in baseball. One hitter gets embarrassed, then the dugout starts pressing. Guys swing earlier, chase more pitches, lose discipline. Sandy created that effect constantly. He made professional hitters doubt themselves. That's real greatness. One thing players respected deeply about Sandy was that he never acted like a celebrity around other ball players. Quiet guy, intelligent guy, private. There was almost a mystery around him because he didn't spend energy trying to become the center of every room. But once the game started, everybody watched him anyway. That's a different level of presence. I think catchers admired Sandy even more because we understood how difficult his style really was. Pitching with that kind of command while throwing that hard takes unbelievable discipline. Most power pitchers eventually lose efficiency. They overthrow, they get emotional. Sandy somehow stayed controlled while still overpowering people. That combination is rare. And honestly, his career almost feels mythical now because it burns so fast. Some players slowly fade over 20 years. Sandy reached a level most pitchers never touch. Then suddenly the story was over before people were ready for it to end. That probably added to the legend too. Because when players talk about Sandy Koh-fax, they usually talk about him almost like a memory from another world. Like baseball briefly produced something impossible for a few seasons. I've met plenty of great pitchers, Hall of Fame pitchers, men who could dominate entire leagues, but very few pitchers ever created the feeling Sandy Koh-fax created. That feeling where hitters walked to the plate already wondering if tonight was going to belong to the pitcher before the first pitch was even thrown. And once a pitcher controls people mentally like that, the game is almost already over. Willie Mays was the player every ball player secretly wanted to be. That's the truth. Even superstar players watched Willie differently. You'd see it during batting practice sometimes. Big league veterans pretending not to stare while Willie was taking fly balls or hitting line drives all over the park. Because with Willie, baseball looked joyful and terrifying at the same time. That combination is rare. Most players are either graceful or dangerous. Willie somehow became both. The first thing that hit you about Willie Mays was his energy. Some older legends carried themselves carefully by the time I came into the league. Their bodies hurt, Their routine slowed down. Willie still moved like the game belonged to him. And honestly, part of baseball probably did belong to him. As a catcher, I always paid attention to how complete a player really was. Fans sometimes fall in love with one tool, home run power, speed, throwing arm. But inside clubhouses, players respected complete baseball more than anything. Willie could do everything: hit for power, hit for average, steal bases, throw runners out, catch impossible balls in center field, read pitchers, read situations, read momentum. He wasn't just talented physically. He understood baseball deeply. That's what separated him from entertainers. Willie wasn't performing baseball. He mastered it. And the scary part was how naturally he seemed to do things other players struggled to survive doing. There are some athletes who make impossible movements look routine. Willie was one of them. You'd watch him drift under a fly ball over his shoulder and realize most outfielders in the league would never even reach that baseball. But Willie reached it casually. Then came the famous basket catch style. The hat flying off while running, the smile. Fans loved all of that. But players noticed something else underneath it all. Confidence. Not arrogance. Real confidence. Willie played like he trusted every instinct he had on a baseball field. That freedom made him dangerous because hesitation almost never entered his game. He reacted faster than most players thought. And pitchers hated facing players like that. One thing I always respected was that Willie genuinely loved being around the game. Some superstars eventually grow tired of the attention, the travel, the interviews, the pressure. Willie still carried enthusiasm for baseball long after most players became bitter veterans. That attitude affects clubhouses more than people realize. Young players relaxed around him, veterans respected him, fans adored him. That's not easy to maintain once fame reaches a certain level. Baseball can harden people over time. Willie somehow kept part of the joy alive. I think that's why older generations still talk about him emotionally. Not just statistically, emotionally, because Willie Mays represented something beautiful about baseball before the sport became overly complicated. Creativity, freedom, instinct, excitement. He reminded people why they fell in love with the game as kids. And I'll say this honestly, if somebody asked me to build the perfect baseball player from scratch, I'm not sure I could come up with anybody better than Willie Mays. Not because he was flawless, because he could affect a baseball game in literally every possible way. Very few men in history could say that. And even fewer could make it look that natural. You know, when people get older, they usually start talking about numbers. Home runs, batting averages, championships, awards. I understand why. Numbers make sports easier to organize, easier to debate, easier to explain across generations. But the longer I've lived around baseball, the more I think the game is really about memories. It's about the feeling certain players left behind. I can still hear the noise from old ballparks sometimes, the sound spikes made on concrete clubhouse floors, the silence before big postseason games, the way veteran pitchers stared into dugouts before first pitch. Baseball stays with you that way. And so do certain players. Hank Aaron taught me what consistency really looked like. Pete Rose showed me how obsession could fuel greatness. Joe Morgan proved intelligence could control a game as much as strength ever could. Sandy Koh-fax showed an entire generation what dominance looked like. Willie Mays reminded everybody that baseball could still feel alive and joyful at the highest level. Different personalities, different styles, different kinds of greatness. But all of them changed the game whenever they stepped onto the field. That's the part younger fans sometimes miss. Back then, certain players carried an atmosphere with them. You felt it in the stadium before anything even happened. Opponents felt it too. Ball players notice presence faster than crowds do. those men had presence. And I feel lucky now that I got to live through an era filled with players like that, because baseball changes. Every generation changes the sport a little more. Some things improve, some things disappear forever, but greatness still looks familiar. It still makes professionals nervous. It still silences clubhouses. It still creates stories people tell 50 years later. And all these years later, when people ask me about the greatest baseball players I ever saw, those are the names that come back first. Not because somebody handed me a statistic sheet, because when I close my eyes, I can still see them playing.